So thank you very much, Matt, for the invitation to come and present an update today, both on the National Secure Milk Supply Project, as well as I have sort of a second very short summary presentations of some of the other national foot and mouth disease preparedness efforts that are ongoing that people should be aware of. It's not necessarily an all-inclusive list, but it's those projects that I'm either partially or tangentially involved with. And so I do also want to mention Dr. Julie Smith is with us here today from University of Vermont, and she's sort of the ringleader of a planning event that's getting underway for a summit in 2013 next year at the NIAA annual meeting in Louisville, Kentucky, correct? So we're planning a one-day summit on sort of all things foot and mouth disease, and so very much looking forward to getting hopefully a lot more detail about some of these projects and making sure everyone's aware not just of these activities, but all the other foot and mouth disease preparedness and planning activities that are ongoing currently. So I did want to ask at the start, how many people in the room? I had the opportunity to present an overview on secure milk supply last year in the bovine committee. We were just getting the project underway, so that talk was more focused on, sort of what the project was and what we were hoping to accomplish in the upcoming year. Today, I'm happy I can tell you what we have accomplished and some of the new things that we're moving on in addressing. But I'm curious how many people here have heard the background information on the Secure Milk Supply Project to some degree, so that will help me gauge how much detail I put into the beginning part of the talk. All right, so about half. Okay, so I'll try to move that through that fairly quickly and get to sort of where we are today and where we're headed tomorrow. So in this half of the presentation, I'm just going to give a couple background comments on, why do we care, why are we working on foot and mouth disease contingency planning, how this sort of relates to the FAD-PREP, or Foreign Animal Disease Foot and Mouth Disease Response Plan, who's involved in this project, what the components are, what we've done to date, and what we're focused on currently. So I just like to remind everyone, why do we care about foot and mouth disease? Well, we know that if we had that disease in this country, it would cause significant economic impacts to our livestock and affiliated industries. Unfortunately, it's present in a large portion of the world at present. Probably 2/3 of the countries have foot and mouth disease in some part of the country and are trying to control it through vaccination or just dealing with it as an endemic disease. So there is a large source of virus out there, unfortunately, that could come into the U.S. either unintentionally or intentionally. Why do we need to plan in new ways? Well, we need to plan in new ways largely because our livestock industries in the United States have changed substantially since the last time we had a foot and mouth disease outbreak, which happened to be back in 1929. Back then, the farms were smaller. We were lucky in these cases the outbreaks weren't perhaps as large as they would be today because there's not quite as much movement amongst the premises within the industries that could be affected. And so we could stamp it out, and we did. The other point based on what Dr. Healy shared with us earlier is that our animal health infrastructure, regulatory infrastructure, is decreasing. So we don't have as many people available in white coats to dig holes. And so, maybe we shouldn't be digging holes. I think we've all we're moving forward in that thought process, and we know that we need to deal with these diseases in new ways. Just a special mention as relates to the dairy industry. One of the initial focuses of the Secure Milk Supply Project is getting raw milk to commercial processing. One of the unique aspects of the disease in lactating dairy cattle is the virus is shed in the milk. It can be shed in the milk several days before the animals become infected. Thus, it can spread disease before anyone knows the cows are sick. While single high temperature or standard pasteurization doesn't completely kill the virus, it reduces it substantially and makes it puts the milk in, makes the milk acceptable for human consumption based on the OIE guidance. But in some cases, we are going to have to deal with public perception related to potentially the virus being in milk. We need to be prepared with communication messages to help mitigate those type of concerns. And we need to, and that's not just for milk, that'll be for meat products as well. So some of the general guidance that we've used in focusing on this project comes from the articles in the OIE Terrestrial Animal Health Code that relate specifically to foot and mouth disease. This is guidance, so it doesn't mean that people have to follow what's in the OIE code, but a lot of what we're proposing in the Secure Milk Supply project as relates to milk movement and the treatment of milk and handling of milk are based on the fact that essentially for human consumption, single high temperature short term and a couple other methods are acceptable, but if there's going to be any consumption of milk by animals, it requires that that product be UHT treated or have be pasteurized doubly by HTST. So just in a couple sentences, what is the Secure Milk Supply Project? It's a dairy industry-focused continuity of business planning effort specifically for foot and mouth disease. It's essentially a industry and regulatory partnership that's facilitated by academia. And what we're hoping is to develop mutually understood and agreed upon response measures that will allow control and containment of foot and mouth disease without undue impact on the industry and their business continuity. The project is being executed in correlation with the National Response Plan, the FAD-PREP Foot and Mouth Disease Response Plan, and ultimately will become an annex to that document. That's the goal. Similarly, the Secure Egg Supply Plan is currently been annexed to the High-Path Avian Influenza Response Plan. So why do we need to work out these procedures for managed movement in the face of an outbreak ahead of time? Well, because there's a lot of commodities or aspects of a livestock business that need to happen on day 2. So people need to be prepared to understand what they need to do on day 2 in order that they can do that quickly and manage the negative impact to their business. As outlined in the FAD-PREP response document, any type of movement of animal or animal product within a control area will only be allowed based on informed by a risk assessment and based on a permit. And that's like an easy sentence to say, but that's very hard to execute quickly if you're not prepared to do it in advance. So the initial goal from the Secure Milk Supply Project is to facilitate moving milk, and that's raw milk to commercial processing, without moving the virus. The goal is that these plans are developed, mature enough, well socialized, and that we have the supportive infrastructure in place that they can be activated very quickly within, a day or two of the initial diagnosis of foot and mouth disease. The individuals involved in this project, the project is funded through USDA out of the National Center for Animal Health Emergency Management, Dr. John Zach. There are individuals in the risk assessment group with the Centers of Epidemiology and Animal Health that are critical collaborators with Dr. Kristen Johnson, who's at University of Minnesota and charged with developing the proactive risk assessment for raw milk movement. The academic partners are myself at UC Davis, Jim Roth and Danelle Beckett-Weddle at Iowa State University, and Tim Goldsmith at University of Minnesota. But really the most important partner on this list, in all honesty, is industry. Industry is the primary stakeholders with regard to this planning effort. They've provided a lot of subject matter expertise as we've developed these products, the products that we've developed to date. It's important that we understand how businesses operate in order that we can account for those things in trying to make recommendations relative to being able to move products safely without spreading disease. They've donated their time in kind in participating in many of our work groups and really deserve a lot of, I have a lot of gratitude for them for the time that they've invested with our project to date. The other group of individuals who are also heavily involved in helping to inform, in particular, some of the what we call the decision management tools that we're trying to develop as part of the projects are the state animal health officials, those individuals who will be involved at the local and regional level deciding what things will and will be allowed. And so when we're developing tools, we need to make sure we're working with the people who are the end users to make sure that they're going to be as useful as possible. So one of the exciting things I can share with the group is that we've seen a large increase in the number of individual states or regional projects since the meeting last year. The North Carolina group has long been involved in response planning in this area, but they're now part of a 5 Mid-Atlantic state group that kicked off a regional planning project in December. The New England group has been around and been active for about 2 years now. We have had an introductory meeting with Colorado, and I'm happy to hear that they're moving forward with their industry on further planning. California had the kickoff meeting that Dr. Healy mentioned in January, so they're formally now working with their industry on adapting some of the national framework to the specific needs of the state. And most recently, the states of Oregon, Washington, and potentially Idaho are looking at beginning a regional project in that part of the country. So to try to help make sure that, in a time of limited resources, that people are aware of what these other efforts are currently focused on, that as much of the information that's developed by these different efforts can be shared. We've put into place a quarterly conference call where people give brief updates on what they're doing. Through this sort of coordination and collaboration, we're hoping that we can, I guess, make the most amount of progress without having reducing duplication of effort as much as possible. So those quarterly calls have been very successful. Anyone who's interested in joining those, even if your state's not currently actively working on tailoring these things to your state or region, please let me know, because you'd be welcome to listen in on the calls. So we started out with a National Steering Committee who helped us formalize some of our initial goals and objectives. We initially also had 4 biosecurity work groups, and then a milk movement decision support tools work group. And then the 5th group was the proactive risk assessment. These 3 groups are actually the first 3 biosecurity work groups have been sunsetted. We've sort of completed our task. We've developed, which I'll mention in a second, but I'll mention it now because I started. We've developed biosecurity performance standards for on-farm, for milk haulers, and for milk processing plants. And we've assembled those with an executive summary that's also available for anybody who's interested. All of our products are available through the FADPrep website, and I don't know how many people use that regularly, but that is a mechanism that USDA also uses to try to disseminate response plans and materials as they're developed and released for circulation. We're really focusing right now on more of this 4th group, the Milk Movement Decision Matrix group. We have a call with the state animal health officials for the beginning of April, where we're hoping to get some more specific input on some of the tools and the recommendations that we've developed to date. And as far as the proactive risk assessment goes, that risk assessment has been essentially completed. There was a conference call in February that shared some of those initial results with those who participated in the call. It's anticipated that that will be released in the near future for further review and comment, and they're actually looking to put together now a work group in that area to help review and refine and improve that as needed. And then using that, we'll go back and revisit the biosecurity performance standards to see if they actually need to be updated. So I mentioned the biosecurity performance standards. Initially we've just been focusing on this movement here highlighted in blue. That's raw milk going to the commercial processing. We know that once we have that worked out, or we have some mutually agreed upon approaches for that, those will help us address many of the other vehicular related movements that are required to keep a dairy in business on a day-to-day basis. One of the things we need to really, I think, start focusing on moving forward would be looking at animal movements for different, not necessarily in an infected zone, but in the zones more on the periphery. We need to start thinking about whether that's going to be permissible at some point under some certain conditions or absolutely not. One of the big concerns that's come up in the discussions in California are the need for daily movements of calves from dairies to calf rearing operations. So probably 70% of the dairies in California currently raise young stock off-site. So if day 2 of an outbreak, those animals will not be able to be moved. And if they're in an infected area or control area, the dairy needs to be prepared for some period of time to care and raise for those animals on site. And today people haven't really thought about how that would really happen. It's a big challenge, one of the things that we're hoping to work on moving forward. The colostrum, does it move around? The milk, all the hospital milk off of many of these dairies that raise their calves off-site are hauled to the off-site calf rear. The colostrum is not generally kept separate. The dairies, if the dairies are retaining ownership of their calves, they tend to be very focused on getting at least 1 or 2 doses of colostrum in their calves, within that period of time before they go to the calf rear.
It's not an issue with it's not moving.
Well, it's important that calves get colostrum, but this doesn't always happen in the context of this system unless the dairy, when the dairy retains ownership of its heifers, they don't generally pay attention. It's interesting, there's a couple big calf rearing facilities that just receive bull calves in the Central Valley. They monitor serum proteins just as a routine management practice. And most of the calves, the bull calves that come in are colostrum deprived. But in the situation that they've established there, they're able to raise most of those calves. I think they have less than a 5% mortality. So they're very sensitive to the fact that they're sort of immune compromised animals and raise them with that in mind, in that case successfully. So the biosecurity performance standards, as I mentioned, are now available, assembled with an executive summary. And what they essentially address is how to get people, transportation vehicles, feed and raw milk onto and off of a farm and a processing plant without the risk of spreading foot and mouth disease. So the decision matrix tools and work group, we're focusing on developing tools to facilitate pre-outbreak decision making and then manage movement during an actual outbreak response. We've put together, which I'll show you in this next slide, a proposed framework, which you'll see now in some of the USDA-related publications for classifying outbreaks in terms of the time frame that you're involved in when you're dealing with the outbreak, so early detection, mid or in the latter phases of an outbreak when you're trying to prove freedom of disease, versus the size of an outbreak, something very small and focal, whatever, a handful of farms, to something that's an outbreak on the national scale. So this is a really helpful tool when dealing with a lot of different emergency preparedness and planning issues, because the choices that you might make or the approaches that you might employ at a given time or for a different size outbreak can be very different. It's definitely not one size fits all. We've made some recommendations that we're hoping that state animal health officials and the federal emergency managers will consider taking action on in event of an outbreak. We've put together recommendations, say, for example, regarding the need not to recall milk that's been commercially pasteurized. And then we've put together a scientific justification for that. These are some of the things that we're looking forward to discussing with the state animal health officials on the call, the NASAHO call, the beginning of April. So some of the challenges that come up in talking about how to actually implement these plans have to do with the large-scale permitting that will be necessary as part of having one of these, the continuity of business plans implemented in a successful fashion. And so we're hoping to get more dialogue and help people understand what these challenges are, and then what tools may be available to help address some of these challenges, or what tools might we need to develop as we move forward. So some of the differences with regards to permitting in an actual outbreak versus daily product movement across state lines is who sets the criteria for issuing that permit. Who manages the data? That's another difference between an outbreak situation versus a daily situation. Who collects the data, manages the data, and how is that, is there a system available for collecting and managing that data and sharing it with those individuals who need to know? And the scale of this, we did, there was a foot and mouth disease exercise in California last September. It involved 2 simulated infected farms in the Tulare County area. And as part of that exercise, we came up with a number for the number of permits that would need to be issued on a daily basis just for the dairy industry. And in those 2 10-kilometer circles, which it's a very high-density dairy region, granted. I think there's about 70 dairies in those 2 circles. They've estimated that they need to issue approximately 250 permits of one type or another. Most of those had to do with permitting raw milk to processing. So we need to think about some of these challenges and how we can address them so that, again, on day 2, we'll be prepared to issue these permits, manage the permits, and enable those movements that are determined to be allowable. So as far as some of the key take-home messages from the decision support group, we really need to think about making as many decisions ahead of time as possible. That's what those recommendations are there for, to try to have people reach agreement where they can on certain things and then put that in the response plan so that we're not stalled out trying to make those decisions in the actual face of an outbreak. And I mentioned the need for a scalable, robust permitting system in order to implement these continuity of business plans, because it's going to require a large number of permits, in many cases for large outbreaks. So I briefly mentioned the proactive risk assessment group. The initial focus of that was just raw milk movement, grade A raw milk movement into, within, or outside of a control area to processing. One of the outcomes of that I can share with you, which will be hopefully good news to most people in the room, is that they really took a look in detail at the risk of bioaerosols coming out of a milk tanker and causing spread of disease, of foot and mouth disease. So this is milk coming out the air filter. It has nothing to do with the mud and manure on the outside of the tanker, which, based on this risk assessment, is the primary risk of spreading foot and mouth disease. So the bioaerosol component was just one part of the larger risk assessment. They considered the potential for disease spread while raw milk was being pumped onto the tanker on farm, and then also through accidental spillage of raw milk through the venting system while the truck was in transit to processing. And ultimately, their assessment was that the risk of that occurring, largely based on particle science and the fact that that liquids would be very hard to aerosolize and that long-distance transport would be very unlikely, is that the risk of bioaerosol spreading foot and mouth disease is low to very low with moderate uncertainty. So the science is not perfect, but this information hopefully will help people decide, in the end, whether or not they think they need filter covers on these milk tankers, which has been a large topic of discussion for many years. And not to mention the fact we don't have those filters in the United States. So if that was a requirement, it's not likely that it would be able to be implemented very quickly either. So lots of challenges remain. Right now, there's a lot of focus on adapting sort of the national guidance, the national proposed framework to states and regions. The other focus, another work group that's ongoing, is looking at trying to work with efforts that are developing more specific SOP level cleaning and disinfection procedures that meet the requirements of local state regulations. So there's a number of efforts underway. There's a Managing Animal Mortalities meeting the week of May 22nd in Dearborn, Michigan, and part of that meeting there's going to be a milk tanker disinfection demonstration. So hopefully, there's some good information that's released or revealed there that can be shared amongst all these efforts, and again, hopefully tailored, because the state and local regulations, with especially regard to managing the runoff from the when vehicles are disinfected, vary greatly. Citric acid is another issue that we've been working on since this project's gotten underway. There's been a lot of desire expressed to have citric acid be on the approved list, or at least, I step back. The desire would be that it would be an approved disinfectant for foot and mouth disease. The more likely option in the near term is that there could be an emergency exemption pre-established with US EPA, so that people knew ahead of time that citric acid would be allowed for use for cleaning and disinfection with regard to foot and mouth disease. There's only currently 5 disinfectants on the approved disinfectant list. Many of those can be difficult to access, difficult to work with, and they're certainly more costly than citric acid. So that is actually ongoing. There's email traffic that I was just looking at last week. So USDA and US EPA are working together to try to see about establishing an emergency exemption for citric acid. As I mentioned, we need to create movement guidance for other movements onto and off of farms, as well as live animals. We need to have more discussion with those individuals who will actually be part of the incident, determining what the permit criteria will be for different types of farms and different locations, and what tools are going to be available to issue those permits and manage those permits in a way that's acceptable with regards to the response. And then, and raw milk processors, that comes up quite a bit in the discussions that we've had related to this project. I think we're going to throw it on the list of recommendations list for upfront discussion. So some states allow raw milk production under certain guidelines. Some states completely prohibit it. But for those states where some raw milk is allowed for sale in some way, it really makes sense to think about ahead of time what might be done with people who are producing raw milk. Will it be prohibited, or will something else be done? But to think about that ahead of time, I think would be very prudent. So, as I mentioned, we have sunsetted the 3 biosecurity work groups with the completion of the final draft, but we do have 3 groups currently active. The Decision Support and Permitting Tools work group that Dr. Jim Roth and I lead, a Cleaning and Disinfection work group led by Dr. Danelle Beckett-Weidel. That's going to be focused on trying to get some more farm and processing plant specific SOPs developed. And then Dr. Tim Goldsmith will be leading the risk assessment work group moving forward as that risk assessment undergoes further evaluation. So I also want to, close making the point that preparedness is a choice. Everybody has a day job and we're all busy. And it's really important. I think I see this as a huge opportunity for industry to engage with regulators ahead of time, to better understand what the implications of some of the control measures will be on their daily business practices. And, hopefully in working together, there can be response plans that are out there that are more conducive, that allow the disease to be controlled without overly impacting, or in a negative way, the daily business practices of the industry, keeping the industry in business while getting rid of the disease. And honestly, biosecurity is going to be key to that. Whether or not we vaccinate, it's going to take us a while to get vaccine, and we may not have enough to go around at the beginning. So, biosecurity is the best defense, and we need to be good about getting that in place immediately if we're going to have a chance, in my opinion. So we do also have a website where information is available on the project. We don't distribute the biosecurity performance standards through this. They're on the password-protected FAD prep site. I thought it would be helpful, too, also to touch briefly on some other foot-and-mouth disease response planning and preparedness efforts that are going on nationally. So we just heard an update on secure milk supply. I'm going to mention a little bit about foot-and-mouth disease vaccination contingency planning, some of the efforts that Dr. Healy already alluded to at the federal level. I can talk about some of the specific work that's being done or has been done in California. An update on where the foot-and-mouth disease bulk milk tank PCR assay is. Some comments on acquiring those bulk milk tank samples for testing, whether it be for foot and mouth disease or other diseases. Quick mention on the DMI crisis drills that were mentioned earlier. And then also discussing a U.S. Dairy Export Council project looking into the inactivation of foot and mouth disease as it relates to other dairy products. And this is being done as an early effort to understand more the potential impacts on exports. So we'll have a talk a little bit later this afternoon focused on impacts to the meat industry largely, the export market, the dairy industry. For the dairy industry, international exports is one of their growing segments of their business. Many of the products that they are exporting and where they see demand from the export side are products that undergo some pretty significant heat treating or cheese. And so I think it's important for them to understand ahead of time whether or not foot and mouth disease may or may not even be present in those commodities ahead of time, and that information then can be used, hopefully strategically, to either maintain or reestablish more quickly those export markets as it relates to the dairy industry. So Dr. Healy mentioned briefly some of the documents that are now becoming available through the National Center for Animal Health Emergency Preparedness. The common operating picture with regards to foot and mouth disease vaccine. There's a number of Well, so some of the key points from that document and from some of the presentations made recently by Dr. Clifford at the NCBA meeting in February is that vaccination will be considered early in the response process. Considered is the important word. It may or may not be necessary for small outbreaks, but it's considered from the beginning. That's important. Whether or not it will be used will depend on a number of different factors, but certainly the magnitude of the outbreak or the perceived spread of the outbreak will be important factors. There are the 4 potential response strategies, 3 of which include vaccination that Dr. Healy mentioned. Each of those strategies have different impacts on different segments of the livestock industries and domestic and export markets, and that APHIS is very interested in continuing to work with stakeholders at the state and regional level to develop a better understanding of which of these approaches may or may not work best in different parts of the country. So I think the key take-home message when we talk about foot and mouth disease vaccination is that one size will not fit all. And of those 4 strategies, if we have a big outbreak in the United States, a multifocal outbreak, we might have some of those different strategies being implemented in different parts of the country at the same time. It is really important, and I can't overemphasize this, that people start to think at the state and regional level about what makes sense for you, and that the livestock industry is engaged in those discussions. That's critical, because in order that the resources even be available to implement anything that people think they might want to do, people need to know ahead of time what they might need. And that gives support and evidence for, at the national level, being able to procure or hopefully resource, especially the vaccine that might be needed in some parts of the country where we have very heavy livestock densities. So some of the documents are out there. These are really great documents that Dr. Zach's group have put together. Pretty much everyone, I'm sure, is familiar with the FAD-PREP Foot and Mouth Disease Response Plan, but they've, at the end of last year, released a foot and mouth disease vaccination ready reference guide. It goes through some of the key considerations and points relative to the decision-making process for vaccinating. And then most recently, they've put out this common operating picture with regards to FMD vaccination, and it gives some really nice specific examples where the likelihood of vaccine with the different options may or may not be used. So people can use this as a starting point and think about, do you agree with this or do you not agree with this in your state or region, and why might you think this work, and why might you have a different opinion? But it's a really good starting point for people to start thinking through the decision-making factors and what type of program might make sense. So vaccination is, this is a slide or a image that Dr. Zach's group put together as well, and it sort of shows the trade-offs between stamping out on the far left and vaccination on the far right, and that they both require resources and large amounts of resources, but different types of resources. And so it's important that people don't think that, gee, we're just going to give a vaccine and we're all going to go home. The logistics behind getting that vaccine, getting it into the animals, identifying those animals, having a system to track and follow and monitor those animals, and then ultimately they're going to need to be tested, blood tested, to prove that they haven't subsequently got infected. Those all require resources too, and a different kind of resource. So we need to keep that in mind. Vaccine isn't, it's not a simple solution. It's still a complicated solution, but it might very well be the right decision, because certainly getting rid of large numbers of carcasses as depicted on the far left side, we know a lot of the challenges associated with that, and that's probably not going to be publicly acceptable. So this is just one image. I think these are some of the numbers that Dr. Healy was sharing with us earlier from the common operating picture document that emergency management's put together. And so for different areas within the United States, they've summarized how many animals by species might be impacted, given that there's outbreaks that have different zones, infected zones, buffer zones, vaccination zones established. And so it really helps you start thinking through the resources that might be needed to actually apply vaccine in a specific geographical area when you start looking at these maps and you start thinking about the number of doses of vaccine you need. Then the mechanism, the question came up earlier, is it going to be, will it be allowable for producers to administer vaccine? I think, current thinking is that is certainly on the table. Again, given that the controls are in place to make sure that the cold chain is maintained, the animals are vaccinated properly, the animals are identified properly, and the information with regards to those animals is properly collected. And that's all feasible and tangible and doable. It eliminates a biosecurity risk of having teams go from farm to farm to try to vaccinate. I mean, honestly, the resource to do that would be enormous. But we need to be having the discussions with industry now, with private veterinarians, with the producers, and they need to understand what their roles and their responsibilities need to be in order, if they want to be part of administering vaccine to their farm. So, these are just numbers from Iowa. There's examples from other states in that document, and certainly it's pretty easy to kind of put these numbers together for yourself. This is just using 2007 NASS data to give some ballpark estimates of livestock numbers that might be in impacted regions. So I've also been really fortunate to work with the California Department of Food and Ag and their Emergency Preparedness and Support Unit and Animal Health Branch on vaccination planning specific to California. And we've sort of categorized the different aspects of vaccination planning into these 4 pillars, which I think might be helpful for people to think about. Most recently, California has been engaged in looking at SOPs, or the actual field level delivery of vaccine from the warehouse where the NVS would deliver it, to actually getting the vaccine into the cows. So the how of implementing the program, who does it, what forms need to be done, who needs to be notified, what types of IDs need to be used. We've talked a lot about the desire to use electronic ID if we're going to have vaccination to live. That'll really decrease the workload with managing that vaccinated population over time. But we probably don't need EIDs if we're using vaccine in animals in a vaccination to slaughter campaign. Things to think about ahead of time. SOPs, checklists, and then they've actually developed these for vaccine, cold chain maintenance, and then they were exercised during a drill last September. The outcome or the experiences in that exercise are now being used, or they have been used, to sort of update those. So I think they're a really, really good start. I know that Dr. Whiteford would be happy to share them with other states that might be interested. They're not perfect, and these are solely focused on dairy cattle, but I think they could be easily adapted to feedlots and commercial swine operations. But some of the challenges that come further upstream are, so from California's standpoint, they talk about the California vaccination plans in terms of if and why they might want to use vaccine. Why would vaccine be part of the response? What industry sectors are affected? What locations in the state might be affected? What are the decision criteria that are used as part of that decision-making process? And doing that planning in close coordination with industry, because if industry doesn't support vaccination, it's really not going to happen. The California vaccination strategy then would be something specific to a given incident. So we know we have an outbreak. The situation dictates that vaccination should be part of the response strategy, and then deciding exactly strategically how do you apply the vaccine in the context of that outbreak. What are the priorities when you have limited resources? What species might get the vaccine? Are you going to vaccinate all species or just cattle? Things like that specific to the incident. And then how they would put together ahead of time, and this is something that they're working with USDA on, is what would USDA want as far as an official request for vaccine? What type of information? So that they can be prepared ahead of time to get that into an acceptable format quickly, because the feeling is in California, if there's foot and mouth disease in the California Central Valley dairy cattle population, you need vaccine and you need it yesterday. So they want to make sure that they're as prepared as possible to request what they think they might need if they need it, and then have the framework in place to get it quickly into the animals. So that's kind of sort of the different components when you think about vaccination planning. So I'll mention for many years, people have talked about the desire to have a PCR assay that would be useful in bulk tank milk from a standpoint of both early detection of foot and mouth disease, where you could get samples every day and screen them, or you would also be able to, in the event of an outbreak, know which areas remain free or have evidence that areas remain free. So it's early case finding, proof of freedom from disease in the areas that you're surveying. So there is a project that was funded by DHS S&T about a year ago. It's a 2-year project. We're about a year into the project. The Foreign Animal and Zoonotic Disease Center at Texas A&M and NVSL FADL are the individuals doing the work. They're optimizing an existing assay for milk. Milk's a difficult matrix to work with because it has a lot of fat. They have, at this point, optimized the assay, and they are just initiating training and then a negative cohort study with a number of non-labs who will be testing bulk milk tank samples from their respective areas in the U.S. to try to develop some of the performance numbers with regards to well, this would be knowing whether or not there'd be a problem with false positives, because we know we don't have foot and mouth disease. Another aspect of the project is taking the assay or getting milk from infected countries to make sure that the assay is also sensitive. So that is actually underway. That's great news because we've talked about it for many years. I also wanted to mention a project. Dr. Stephanie Ostrowski is a veterinarian who's currently a food safety resident at the California Animal Health and Food Safety Lab. She has taken on a project that's sort of complementary to secure milk supply and foot and mouth disease preparedness in many ways. She's working with CDFA and the lab to establish a system and an understanding within the regulatory, within CDFA, the lab, and the industry as far as how you could rapidly access and receive bulk milk tank samples from representing different geographical regions within California to the laboratory for diagnostic testing quickly in a form that is where the sample is identifiable back to the dairy of origin. And these samples could be screened not just for foot and mouth disease, but also for any type of other food safety related incident or concern, some potential contamination. So, we don't have to have a bulk tank assay in place yet to have a system in place actually to get the samples. So it's a sort of a planning and preparedness effort that can be done in peacetime, and hopefully being set up in peacetime will allow better and quicker utility during an outbreak. And this project, when it's done, this information is available to be shared with other states or interested individuals. I'm almost done.
Great.
Okay.
We're right on time.
Okay, good. It's hard because I don't have a clock today, so
Well,
I figured. Okay. Fair enough. So I did want to mention the DMI crisis drills. Dairy Management Incorporated is funded through the Dairy Checkoff Program. They traditionally hold a series of crisis drills annually focused on a specific crisis activity of interest to the dairy industry. And last year they chose to focus their drills on foot and mouth disease. There were drills held in Baltimore, Kansas City, and Denver. They were highly successful. People were very interested and engaged in them. The emergency management folks in Riverdale, John Zach, has actually participated in all 3 of those drills. And because of the popularity of these drills, they've gone ahead and actually decided to continue the series in this year. So there's a drill that was held in Minneapolis, and then there'll be drills now in Albany, Sacramento, and Phoenix. These drills are focused on communications. They're not focused on like a field response or operations. They're focused on the communications aspect of a response between government, industry, and also focused on dealing with some of the consumer perception issues and dealing with the social media, things that are all going to be very important to do if we are faced with an outbreak. And I already mentioned the U.S. Dairy Export project, which has just been funded. Iowa State will be doing the work, and we're hoping that this project will identify what information exists and what gaps might be there to determine if perhaps research needs to be funded to fill some of those gaps, and then ideally, depending upon what information is found and what can be generated, essentially if the science supports it, supports that certain products do not carry risk, then that information can potentially go forward through the CVO's office, Dr. Clifford's office, to the OIE, and potentially the safety or the need not to restrict trade of certain commodities long-term end goal could actually be incorporated into the OIE code if the data is there to support it. So that's sort of the longer-term goal of this effort that's just underway.